This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right, so what I was saying about this figure here is that you can see that the water is pooling on top of the surface of the marsh instead of draining as it should, and that's causing the vegetation to convert to open water, and then that kind of runs it creates this kind of runaway negative feedback loop where more and more vegetation is lost, and eventually the entire marsh converts to open water. And so we're seeing that in a lot of marshes. You probably noticed that in your own marshes in your backyards. You can see the ditches, and you can see that in some places there's water pooling and the marsh is getting wetter and wetter on the surface. And so what the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture has done is we've kind of looked at these Saltmarsh Sparrow trend estimates and come up with a population target that we want to shoot for. So back in 2012, the Saltmarsh Sparrow population was estimated to be at about 60,000 birds. And it has about a 9% annual decrease in the population. So kind of projecting that 9% loss out, you'll see that the bird is, expected to kind of blink out by the middle of the 21st century. So we are currently, hold on, there we are. We are currently here. This is 2023, and we want to move about to the 2021 point. That's where we'd like to stay. But we know that things are going to continue to decline and before we can kind of turn them around. So our goal is about 25,000 birds, which is this line here. And there's also this critical minimum threshold of 10,000 birds, at which point, if your population gets that low, they're at much greater risk of extinction and having, a major storm event or something wipe out a huge percentage of the population. So we're really trying to turn things around before they get to this critical minimum of 10,000 birds. And so we've kind of projected out different growth curves and just kind of using the middle one of a 2.5% annual growth. We're thinking that we, turning it around by 2030, making sure that we put enough habitat and restoration on the ground that the marshes are becoming more healthy and resilient so that they can continue to support healthy Saltmarsh Sparrow populations. Then we can continue to do that to build more and more habitat, turn the population curve around, and meet our 25,000 bird goal sometime around when they were previously expected to be going extinct. So how do we get there? Well, first, it's important to figure out where the most important places are to work, identify what exactly needs to be done in those places to achieve our goals. We have to find all the resources that we need to do the work, which is both people capital as well as a tremendous amount of funding that's needed, because saltmarsh restoration work is not cheap. It's usually in the multi-millions of dollars to do restoration work, and then do the work. So it sounds really simple on the surface, but it's quite complicated, but we're getting there. So what we first did was broke down how many acres and birds every state is going to need to meet that goal, so that every state can kind of have their marching orders. And so we have short-term goals, which is the 2030 goals, at which point we want to turn that curve around and start having it go the other direction. And then we have these long-term goals by, 2069, how many acres of marsh do we need to be supporting this 25,000 bird goal? So every state has their bird goals and acre goals. And so New York looks like there's a 1,338 acre high marsh goal, which equates to about 12,000 acres of total marsh. So high marsh is usually about a third to a little bit more than a third of the salt marsh system. And so if you want to get a certain number of acres of high marsh, you need to have, twice as much of the overall marsh habitat, which includes low marsh and mudflat and the other marsh habitats. And then we worked with partners in all of the states to identify the highest priority marshes for restoration in each of the states. And we created this nifty little online mapper. All the orange areas are the highest priorities, the pink areas are the runners up, and the green areas are what we're calling reference marshes, where we're suggesting people just kind of leave it alone, that it's doing as good as it can right now, and we don't want to muck it up. Did you have a question? So this tool is on our website, and you can also, there's these little filters, which I can't click on here because this is just an image, but You can also click these little filters and look at like, well, where are the places where we need to remove tidal restrictions? Where are the places where we need to add more sediment to the marsh to build elevation? And you can click those little filters on and it'll just show those places on. And then we took those regional priorities, and those are actually stepped down to the individual states. So every state has a state management guidance document. These are all found on our website too, if you're interested in checking out New York's document. But this is a little snapshot of what's in New York's state document. And these are all the priority marshes in New York. And it looks like you guys are up here, which is this kind of zoom in here of the marshes. And so every single marsh that is listed on this map in that document has an individual kind of like high level marsh plan that identifies what's the current status of that marsh and what are the things that need to happen to that marsh to get to resiliency. And so just pulling out this one near where your Audubon chapter is, you have the only reference marsh in New York. So the recommendations for this marsh are to just leave that alone. And then this high priority marsh here in orange, which is the Broad Meadow Narrow River Marsh and the Long Beach Bay marshes. And so the recommended management actions in that area, just as an example, are to restore tidal flow to places where it has been restricted and replace and enlarge. There's apparently a culvert in here somewhere that needs to be replaced in order to allow natural tidal flow up into these marshes to continue to bring in sediment and allow vegetation, salt marsh vegetation to persist. And we were talking about Phragmites a little bit before this call started, but one of the easy ways to control Phragmites is through salt water. And so oftentimes Phragmites grows because the salt water has been restricted in some way, and it has reduced the salinity behind the restriction that allows the Phragmites to come in. Phragmites doesn't grow in like the very salty parts of the salt marsh. So when you restore natural hydrology to a marsh, oftentimes it will naturally get rid of the Phragmites. But you have to do it carefully because you can't just always just open up a tidal restriction, because oftentimes the land behind the restriction has sunk. And if you open it, it will just flood it and it'll be all open water. So you have to kind of like build the elevation slowly over time. So what are the things that we're doing in these areas? There's two kind of prongs to success here. One is to warn and to create high quality, high marsh habitat. And then the second prong is to protect these areas in the marsh migration zone, where marsh currently isn't, but where based on sea level rise projections, the marsh is going to need to be in the future. So we need to make sure that those areas aren't developed or have restrictions that don't allow the marsh to migrate upslope. And so it's really important to work on protecting those areas so that that land is available and ready for the marsh to migrate into it over time. And then we have a series of high severity management actions, include these 4 things, which I'll go through one by one in the next slides. So the first is ditch remediation. This is basically a gentle way of healing the human created ditches on the marsh surface. And it involves cutting salt hay on the marsh platform, rolling up that cut hay and putting it into the ditches. And then kind of like twining that down. You can see the twine here with stakes and holding that vegetation in the ditches. Then every time that marsh platform floods, those ditches are getting flooded and they're filtering out sediment and capturing the sediment, keeping the sediment in the ditches. And then of course they have this natural seed bank that's already there, so that when the elevation is high enough to allow vegetation to grow, you start getting natural vegetation growing in the ditches. And then that continues over the course, these continuous layering of the salt hay into the ditches continues over the course of several years, until you kind of reach a little bit, like usually about 5 centimeters below the surface of the marsh is what they're targeting. And you can see here, this used to be open water, and now there's this low marsh vegetation growing there. So over the course of time, we would build it up so that there's high marsh vegetation can grow in those ditches. Another technique that we use a lot of, our partners use a lot of, and when I say we, I mean our partnership, which is everybody. Like we, the joint venture staff that work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, we don't do any of this on the ground stuff. It's all, we just support this work through a variety of, planning tools and resources. We, try to ghostwrite grant proposals and things like that to bring in funds, raising the elevation of salt marsh, the profile of salt marsh with decision makers. That's the kind of work we do. So our partners are the ones on the ground doing this kind of work. And so this runneling practice is basically digging channels in the marsh that are very shallow and small. So they're not ditches. They're just like little runnels, little channels. And so the point of the runnel is to drain these areas of artificially impounded water on the surface of the marsh. So you got to get rid of that standing water so that the vegetation actually has a chance to recolonize and grow and then begin recapturing sediment and building elevation. So these are like before and after pictures. This is what this marsh looked like when they started. This is after the runnel has already drained most of the vegetation. And then this is a vegetated area that was previously marsh flat. Another technique is elevation enhancement. This is by far the most expensive option, but we're trying to find ways to make it less expensive and more kind of the status quo of what happens when municipalities and agencies dredge channels. They oftentimes are just tossing that dredge, dumping it in the middle of the ocean. What we're trying to redirect that resource that is being thrown away basically onto this marsh surface instead, and keep that sediment in the system instead of letting it just get lost or thrown away. And so there's a number of different projects that are ongoing where people have successfully done that. And it basically, you take that dredge material and you spray it out over the surface of the marsh, and you can put it as thin as a few centimeters or inches to as thick as a foot. Like some people are like, this marsh is going to be lost. It is going to sink. It's drowning. We've lost this marsh unless we do something drastic. Let's reset the whole thing. And like, that's actually these two pictures here are a marsh in Connecticut where they literally put like a foot of sand on the marsh. And then they did some plantings and stuff to see if they could get it to revegetate. And it's actually, this used to be a full sand flat, and you can see the vegetation is starting to grow in these parts of the marsh. In other marsh systems, they've done just very thin. It's called thin layer deposition. Thin layer of sediment on the marsh surface so that the plants can just naturally grow through it. You're not killing the marsh. The plants are still able to grow through that layer of sediment. And so that's another really important management technique. And then the last one is what we're calling facilitated marsh migration. And this is basically helping the marsh to migrate. So it seems like it would naturally just migrate on its own into the uplands, and in some cases that is happening. So you can see this is in Maryland, and you can see that there's these old dead remnants of trees where the marsh the salt has killed the trees. They're called ghost forests, where there are these forests that are just dead and standing because of saltwater intrusion. And in this case, this marsh vegetation is, surrounding these trees and actually migrating naturally into the uplands. By far, the more common scenario is something that looks like this, which is also in Maryland, where instead of salt marsh vegetation, you're getting Phragmites because it's at that upper end of the salinity gradient where Phragmites does really well. And it's obviously very competitive, and it can colonize these degraded areas really quickly. And so once you get Phragmites, you're not getting your native salt marsh grasses at all. And so one of the things that managers are just now starting to do, and there's not many examples of this being done, but there's a few, is to manage that Phragmites so that the natural vegetation can come in. There's also been some talk and some very limited testing of removing snags and trees that are dead from the marsh, because Saltmarsh sparrows obviously don't recognize a salt marsh grass with trees as habitat. So they wouldn't even think to nest in a place like that. So one thing people are trying is like, well, what if we got rid of all the trees and then we would create more habitat that way? It's unclear though, like whether that will work or not, because there's all these concerns about, well, what happens when the root balls of the trees start decomposing? Will the marsh start collapsing, and then will it flood? And so a lot of unanswered questions there. And then we are tracking our progress to the best we are able. And so we have this project inventory online where we show where you can click on any of these little dots and read about the projects that are happening in your state. And it's not complete by any means. It takes work to put projects in here, and people are busy, and it's hard to get, the time to kind of take your time away from these really urgent things to put projects into the database. So we have about 65 projects in there right now for about 37,000 acres of habitat improvement. But there's a lot more than that going on out there. But this is just a way to kind of show decision makers and funders and partners like that this is a big movement, and there's a lot of people and a lot of work going on out there. So there's definitely a huge amount of momentum growing for the Saltmarsh Sparrow. Just since we adopted this effort, there's been millions of new dollars raised for saltmarsh restoration since 2018. It's kind of like growing like wildfire. Like we almost can't even keep up with it. It's become a top priority for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Northeast region, and it's been adopted as major priorities of the state wildlife agencies, a major funder, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, our NGO partners. I mean, a lot of these folks have been working on saltmarsh sparrows for a long time. And it's just kind of recently where I think probably just maybe in this administration where we have a really friendly administration that cares about climate change and coastal resiliency, where there's a lot of new focus on this and more money going into supporting coastal resiliency efforts. And I just wanted to share this because this is Parade magazine, which is of course a very general audience kind of magazine. And this came out in 2022. And my boss took a picture of this and sent it to me. She's like, look at the Saltmarsh sparrows in there. And it's profiled in this page full of polar bears and tigers and puffins and all these charismatic megafauna. And there's this little brown bird that nobody's ever seen. Nobody cares about, no one even knew existed. Everybody knows that puffins and tigers and bears exist, but nobody knew that this little Saltmarsh sparrow existed. And it made it in this center spread of Parade magazine. So it's kind of to me like an indicator that this little bird is becoming a household name. It's becoming associated with climate and coastal resiliency. So I think that's pretty cool. And so the big question that I often get is this going to work? We obviously are running out of time for the Saltmarsh sparrow. The modeling projections all predict that if nothing is done, this bird will hit a threshold where it will become impossible to breed. It will be impossible to get a 26-day nesting cycle successfully completed before flooding. The predictions are dire, but there's a tremendous amount of people and partners and money and work going on out there right now for this work. And so there are techniques now that we didn't know about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, that are all so far showing positive trends in the exact right direction that we want them to go. We don't know if they're going to create saltmarsh sparrow habitat. That kind of habitat takes time to build. It requires time for thatch layers to develop and habitat to develop. But right now, what we are seeing is that all of these restoration techniques are leading to a more natural marsh that is naturally vegetated. The hydrology is improving and it's trending in the right direction. So only time will tell, but I'm feeling optimistic. And even if we fail, let's say we fail miserably and that we lose the Saltmarsh sparrow and it goes extinct. Well, I don't think that that's a failure, because it is a failure, of course, for the Saltmarsh sparrow, but all of this investment and time figuring out what works in the Saltmarsh system is improving the health and resiliency of the coastal system. And so these coastal systems are going to be in a better place regardless. And all the birds that are less sensitive, but that still rely on the Saltmarsh system, maybe they're going to be okay then, because all of this time and effort was put in now before their populations got to a place where they're in the emergency room. And so I think that's all really important. And of course, there's all the benefits of coastal systems that, if this system goes away, it doesn't just come back. If it converts to open water and there's nowhere for the marsh to be in the upland, you have lost that system. And I think that message is really sinking in with decision makers and Congress and funders, that like, we can't just let this slip away through our fingers. We have an opportunity now, and we need to take advantage of that now, because this opportunity is only going to be available to us for a short time. And with that, I can take any questions that folks have.
I have a question. That was fascinating. Wow, I didn't.
Yeah,
that's
thank you. That was
amazing.
great.
Yeah. In Orient, where you showed the orange, we know exactly where those dikes are. What was the thinking at the time? Why were they put up by the Army Corps of Engineers at the time? Like, why did they think that was going to protect?
I have no idea. I'm sure I don't know the specifics of any of the particular impacts that have been done. It might have been to protect communities. It might have been some kind of mosquito control thing, might have been for a road. I have no idea.
You don't control it, but
No, it was protecting farmland. There was a hurricane, and they put them up as as the Army Corps of Engineers does always. Sure. Oh yeah, we'll fix that later.
So how do you, so I guess part of the task of when you want to take them down, you have to convince homeowners nearby that like think they're being protected by them, that like they're actually being protected more by not having them. That's a learning curve, I'm sure, for the homeowners.
Yep, and that is the hardest thing. That is definitely the hardest thing. There's a great example of at Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware. They did this like $38 million wholesale restoration of the entire system, because they had these impoundments that were, every time there was a storm, everything was just getting blown out, and they'd rebuild them and it would blow out again. And there was flooding throughout all the communities behind the refuge. And they were like, you know what, we can't keep doing this. Let's just restore the whole system. And they restored the entire beachfront. They trucked in, I don't even know how many, like football fields of sand, and built a whole beach system. They restored the entire marsh behind the beach system. And they had to go through all of these conversations with the local community of like, is this going to be a flooding risk? Like, we don't want you to remove these impoundments. They're protecting our communities. And what happened was when they did the full restoration, it is just like functioning and working like a charm. Like the flooding in the local communities has been completely reduced in these storms. They're not having the same kind of problems anymore, and the community is really happy with it. But it's hard to convince people that you're taking down the wall that's protecting me from the sea. How can that possibly be good for me? It's hard.
Yeah.
I don't want to hog, but I have another question.
Yeah.
In the 50s out here, and I guess it was in the 60s, they did all these mosquito trenches. Now,
yeah.
Are you saying that these mosquito trenches either let the water in and out, or they're actually letting too much water in? I didn't figure that out when you said that.
It's both. They were originally dug, it was either for mosquitoes or ag, depending on what marsh. But it is basically allowing the marsh to drain faster. Like the intent was get the water off the marsh. Don't let there be water there to get in the way of my hay fields. And I don't want water in there to allow mosquitoes to breed. So that was the original intent, is like get the water off the marsh. But now as the seas are rising, these two things together are exacerbating each other. And so as the seas rise, they're more often now breaching the ditches. And because the ditches were excavated, that excavated material was placed along the edge of the ditch. There's a little bit of higher elevation right at the edge of the ditch before it goes down to like the marsh platform elevation. So when the water rises up over those little berms, it spills into the platform of the marsh, and then that can't get out. And so now there's all that water just pooling between the ditches because it can't get over those berms. And so it's stuck on the surface of the marsh.
I was under the impression, it's John Whitmerk here. I was under the impression that there was a project plan for the northeast section of Narrow River Road. I'd heard last year that it was funded, and I don't know if you know anything about the project as to when it's supposed to begin or if it's going to begin.
I don't know the specifics of local projects. I'm just quick pulling up our little project list. We have a list of projects that are in need of funding that's almost 200 projects long right now. And so it's you said it's Narrow River.
Yes, and
So-
while you're looking, John, I believe I heard recently that it is still happening, but I know when they first, they had informational meeting about it, like, and I knew it's like a long-term thing that wasn't going to start for at least a year, but that was at least a year ago, so.
Because I heard about it just before COVID. And I think somewhere in that range, I heard that the town had agreed to its contribution for the funding. I guess John Sepp's involved in it, and maybe that's a place to follow up.
Yeah, we'll have to find out. That's a good
Yeah,
question.
I don't know. I did just stick in the chat the New York State Restoration Management document. And I haven't read through to see if your particular project is mentioned in here, but this is basically like encapsulating the need for New York's marshes, and which it's that little map I showed you in the presentation, and then you can read about every single one of those marshes and what are the recommended management actions. So it might be in there.
Have you charted the approximate dates that the birds are sort of returning to their nesting areas, sort of, going south to north?
Yeah, I think they're returning probably in early May, maybe even earlier than that. And they stick around for a while. They're often still hanging around in September, but I think they're mostly done nesting by August, by mid to late August.
Any of
Are the Saltmarsh Sparrows territorial, or we have multiple groups nesting within the same area?
Yeah, they're bizarre. They don't do territories at all. It is not their thing. They all just, they can be nesting like practically right next to each other. And so the males expend almost no energy on territory defending. Their strategy is to get as many females carrying their eggs, laying their eggs as possible.
I have another question that I have noticed. I have noticed that the upland, because of I think it's the rising sea level, what's happened is the water table seems to be coming up and flooding the marshes, the woodlands that are around the marshes.
Oh,
So it seems to me like the marshes are moving upland. I imagine it's a slow process, but I noticed an awful lot of trees dying and the marsh and the woodlands getting wetter. And I mean, it seems like that's sort of a natural process as the whole land settles, but is there, what can I do to help?
Yeah, that is because of sea level rise. Those upland areas are now getting in the water table is getting saltier. And so their roots are starting to contact salt water, and they do not do well with salt water and they die. And I don't think there's anything you can do about it, honestly, right now. I think the jury is still out on how to deal with it. There's been just a couple of small projects in the mid-Atlantic where they're trying to clear trees to see if that can create better Saltmarsh Sparrow habitat, because they don't recognize trees as part of their habitat. But it remains to be seen whether that's the best approach or not, because those root balls, they can start decomposing, and then that would create pockmarks in the marsh, and people aren't really sure if that's going to be a bad thing or if it's even going to happen at all. So yeah, we don't really know the answer to what to do about it, other than protecting the land where the marshes need to migrate is one thing that private landowners can definitely do, like through conservation easements and things like that. That's kind of the only thing that we can do right now, is to make sure that land is there so we can tinker with it, but we don't really know how to tinker with it yet.
Thanks. Does anybody else have a question?
there any specific predators? I mean, other than the habitat problem, what other dangers do they have?
Yeah, predation is the second greatest cause of mortality for saltmarsh sparrows. There's parts of New Jersey where it is higher than nest flooding in terms of the impact on saltmarsh sparrow populations. And the predators are endless. I mean, it's everything. I mean, even deer will eat saltmarsh sparrow eggs if they find them. So it's avian predators, it's mammalian predators, ungulates, raccoons, foxes, crows, ghost crabs. Like, I mean, it's everything. And no one has really quite figured out how to deal with the predator problem either. You know, because you can set up all manner of exclosures, but you can exclose the mammalian predators, but then you've got crows coming in from above, and you can't exactly like fence out the top. You can't net out the top, and then you're also looking at, you know, disturbing the birds in ways that would cause them to maybe abandon their nests or not return, you know, to that nest area. So there's all kinds of problems with trying to figure out how to manage the predator pressure as well. Keep cats indoors. That's one way to do it. Cats are a big predator.
Yes, keep cats indoors, so important. Would you consider them, we were watching Nature last night on public TV, you know, about how the otters keep the kelp forest healthy, and I've seen other, you know, programs about how beavers keep, you know, the water flowing, and so, and would you consider, that's really what you're describing, that the saltmarsh sparrows are doing, they're keeping the marsh healthy without them, right? I mean, so does that make them like a keystone species of that area?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the sparrows themselves are, I think the marsh is keeping the sparrows healthy, or if the marsh was healthy, it would be keeping the sparrows healthy. But in terms of how we use the sparrow as this like flagship species, it definitely is keeping the marsh healthy, because saltmarsh sparrow is just one of these things where it's becoming, everybody knows what the saltmarsh sparrow is in the conservation community. Like they're all talking about saltmarsh sparrow, saltmarsh sparrow, saltmarsh sparrow. So in a sense, it's a keystone in that way, like in a very human way. Like not necessarily in an ecological way, but like that saltmarsh sparrow is really grabbing attention right now.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, wonderful, fantastic, and we still have a couple of minutes left in our next, you know, our second 40-minute Zoom. Oh my God, I am so sorry.
No worries.
Accounts, we have a paid accounts, but somewhere in the switching of it, this meeting had been set up, and anyway.
No worries.
Everybody, and thank you, Aimee, so much. That was really, really wonderful. And thank you, John, for finding Aimee to give us this program. So
You're very welcome.
great night, and it'll be recorded, but in 2 segments. So we'll have it on our, we have a YouTube channel, so it'll be on there.
Great.
All right, thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.